I mean, what jumps out at me is that we have to have this discussion, this debate, this row in a context, because everything is always relative and proportionate to the whole. And I read this morning a report in the Irish Times from Swiss bank UBS, where during the height of pandemic, from April to July, the billionaire's wealth on the planet rose by over 1/4, 27.5% to be precise. And I want the Green Party Minister to listen to this, because these would be the type of issues that I'm familiar with the Green Party raising in the past. Billionaires' wealth on the planet is at a record high of €8.7 trillion. And they did this by betting on the recovery of the global stock markets during the lockdown. So I think we have to have that discussion in the discussion about the cuts to people's payment relative to this, because, as Deputy Murphy pointed out earlier on, Ireland has, shockingly, the 5th highest rate of billionaires per capita. That means there's lots of wealth slushing around this country. And we're talking today to tens of thousands of workers who have lost, since the 17th of September, €50 a week, and more who've lost since the 1st of September, over €100 a week in the wage subsidy scheme. Now, some people here mightn't think that's a lot. I note both ministers quoted extensively from ESRI studies, and where the ESRI was asked to undertake an impact assessment on the introduction of the revised rates of payments in September 2020, and they found the changes had very little impact on the risk of poverty. It's extraordinary that the ESRI could come up with that sort of a result 20 days after €50 is taken each week from these families. And in the course of that 20 days, they're looking at bills from banks, from landlords, where restrictions have been lifted. Many of them are looking at the possibility of eviction. In fact, we tried to have the restoration of the anti-eviction legislation that was brought in by this government, brought before the House today, but we're blocked in doing so. But nevertheless, this is hugely important, because, as many deputies have pointed out, the details of the cruelty, from not being able to put the food on the table, not being able to pay the rising energy costs. In fact, and it's worth for the House to note, that on board Gas are insisting on retrieving the €100 they gave to people with card meter bills at 60% each time they make a payment. So on these cold days, if you put €20 in your meter, you get about €8 back in energy. And that has to end. That is extremely cruel on families who are already struggling coming into the winter. And it should also be noted that if you're out of work for a long period of time through no fault of your own because of the pandemic, then you are using more energy at home to keep the place warm and to keep and more electricity to keep the place alive. So there are more and more struggles that people have to face, and this government thinks that it's not so bad to take that money from them. I would describe it as an arbitrary and cruel mechanism to make the books balance and to extend out your fiscal prudence. But remember, this is not your money. It's not coming out of the back pocket of Pascal Donoghue or Heather Humphreys. This money will ultimately be paid back by us all, just as we're still paying back the bank bailout of €64 billion. I want to take a minute to discuss the employment wage subsidy scheme. You see, there's been a severe reduction from 410 to 203 a week in this subsidy, and many workers cannot claim a top-up, unless, of course, they're not rostered to work. And in the case of Aer Lingus, many workers find it impossible to get their bosses to sign their social welfare forms, so they struggle from week to week without any income coming in because of shoddy or irresponsible administration on behalf of their companies. In the case of the employment wage subsidy scheme, in other countries, there are severe structures put on companies who receive them. For example, CEOs can't have bonuses. You're not allowed to engage in tax avoidance with offshore subsidiaries. There's nothing like that in this state, except that you have to show that you have a 30% decline in your turnover. And we know that many companies who made vast profits prior to the pandemic, like the meat plants, Boston Scientific, Ryanair, Aer Lingus, etc., have reserves and have had vast profits in the past, but they have their hand out to the state to avail of this scheme. So that cut, which is hitting workers, is also unjustifiable and is dealt with in our motion. I want to refer to something that was repeatedly brought in by the ministers who spoke against our motion. And they keep talking about what people were on prior to receiving the payment. So, for example, 129,500 people are being paid at the rate of 300 on average, €300 a week on average, and that represents in excess of 60% of prior average income for that group. Now, does that not jump out at people that what's wrong with this country is the level of low pay that is predominant throughout this country and that affects the tens of thousands of workers that are the subject of this cut? The levels of low pay are shocking and probably among the greatest in Europe relative to our cost of living. And so, therefore, if you're looking at somebody who's better off on €300 a week now, they would have had to be earning less than $20,000 a year before the pandemic. And that is a shocking indictment of this system that we live under. Plus, this week, the government have endorsed a 10-cent increase in the minimum wage. Well, yahoo-ha, that is going to go a long way to put more gas into the meter and to pay back the landlord and the banks. So overall, I think what you're doing is immoral, not just of its own, but in the relative context of the wealth that exists in this society and in the relative context of the urgency and the emergency that we're facing. The previous minister said this was brought in an emergency because of the pandemic. The pandemic has not gone away. The pandemic does not recognise bills. The pandemic does not recognise the desperation that these people are suffering. So do the right thing and restore these cuts.